Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Gnosis and Science podcast. In this episode, I am going to be covering semiconductors and their function and how we can use this to deepen our understanding of how things like information actually flow from higher to lower density realities, and also how we as souls ascend along the scale invariant axis to higher timelines, and how karma actually plays out, and how this changing of information plays out along different time scales and on both the personal and larger like societal and civilization level. So right after posting the last episode, I came across an article from WDC TV News, originally talking about a study published in Science Advances in 2023 by the physicist Kostya Trekhnuk. Okay, I probably butchered that. It's from Queen Mary's University of London. The article is talking about how scientists had recently discovered that there is a fundamental constant that sits at an incredibly narrow sweet spot that allows set limits for the viscosity of liquid, and how the liquid this viscosity allows for like liquid to flow properly in cells, but also blood, water, just any liquid, and how changing this universal constant slightly means that life would become impossible. Now, referencing what we were talking about last episode, this got me thinking about how with light and energy taking the path of least action, like with the Tadachrone and Vikistochrone curve, and how it bends between media of different densities, and these different densities of reality are very much so like oil and water, and how you can think of space-time is like a river flowing from its source at the peak of a mountain down to the bottom, and as it flows down from the peak to different like biomes, then it supports a certain type of life. So think of this river of space-time as changing its viscosity as it flows from one layer to the next, and as it goes from a higher viscosity to a lower one, you're actually going down in the number of spatial axes, or you're going down in dimensions, essentially. So this is also a good way to introduce you to today's topic, which is how the information actually moves from these different densities of reality, and how souls go from these different densities, both on a small individual scale and a larger macro scale. So first we need to look at Coulomb's law, which describes how electrostatic forces of attraction and repulsion interact between two charged particles. So there's a epsilon in this mathematical function. It's essentially the fundamental constant. And this constant is expressed through the permittivity of space, or how easily electric fields exist in empty space. So this would be dependent on the density of reality. So a property of this vacuum or space is the conversion factor between a charge and how much like source and like force you have. and what that source produces at a distance. So this sets the scale of how strong the electric interactions are in our universe. So it describes the response of space and charge, which creates a distortion in the electromagnetic field. So this determines how much the field affects and changes things in response. So a soft medium or a lower density of reality allows for a more malleable and fragmented concept of self, and also allows for the linear perception of time. And this linear perception of time with cause and effect, this view allows for the process of self-reflection and the integration of seemingly separate aspects of our psyche. So a stiffer, denser medium or a higher layer of reality means there's more resistance to generating a field, as the concept of self is far more rigid and one's perception of time is far less linear, as the distinction between self and other is less and less. While at a lower density of reality, the concept of self is more malleable, allowing for a greater change in the fields that we produce. So you can view the key difference in the scale of expression. So this would be from like humans to devas or higher density archetypes, deities, whatever you want to call it. To give you a kind of analogy, you can think of like in terms of Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z. So there's like most people on Earth are just humans, and then there's some people that are like Krillin and Yamcha. Compared to humans, they're absolutely nuts. They can do crazy things. But then there's outliers, and these would be like the Saiyans, the warriors, and this is like drawing parallels between like spiritual warriors where you like resist temptation to ascend to higher states of being. Like this would be like saints, bodhisattvas, Buddha, Jesus, that sort of thing. So Super Saiyan is like reaching a certain level of self-mastery or enlightenment or attainment, essentially. So the charge is like a source with fields being patterns in space. And the universal constant, epsilon or epsilon naught in the equation itself, is spirit. It is the passive aspect of divinity. It's the stiffness, it's the hard limit of each medium or density of reality, which is determined by our level of self-understanding and what our consciousness has, which ultimately determines the scale of expression and where the soul naturally rests. To give you an idea, think of a projector in a movie theater where there's like the light cone radiating out from the projector, and along this cone there could be different scales or screens. Think of these as like barriers. And depending on where the screen is along the light cone, the screen itself is going to be a different size to capture the full scale of the image, getting larger and larger until you get to the screen on the wall, which we would see as our reality. Now, the screen closest to the projector is the highest density of reality, and getting further away, it's lower. But admittedly, this is a bit counterintuitive because of the whole scale thing. Again, as you get to higher levels of reality, it is a larger scale of expression. So this is a bit counterintuitive. You kind of have to switch it around. But again, remember that the universe acts as a mirror, so I'm essentially using a mirrored visual metaphor to explain a paradox. So I think I'm doing a pretty good job in that case. Next, let's look at the delta function. And so this delta function represents the attracting force relative to its position. So with an electric field, we can think of this as an x and y axis. So the x and y axis is like there's a pulling force with a photon at the center. So if a electron is moving from one position to another, let's say R1 to R2, it is actively going down in density. So it is essentially either going up or down, and it is changing potential energy into kinetic energy as it falls. And this is not too dissimilar to the idea that Simone Weil has of gravity and grace, where in the pursuit of true freedom, each individual must actively resist a pull to base impulses. Things like desire, ego, appetite, attachment, fear, or things like emotional reactivity. And this, I don't mean like through like forceful striving or egoic control or domination, but grace, which is acting as a higher ordering principle that arises from non-attachment, where we start to act in alignment with our true selves. And as we actively fight these baser impulses, we are ascending along the scale invariant axis to a higher point of potential. Like you start a workout routine, that is you actively taking steps to reach a higher potential, a higher timeline, a higher state. If you cut out certain foods from your diet, that is very much so the same thing. If you are meditating and going to therapy to counteract certain base impulses for like interpersonal relationship dynamics, that is again the same thing. It's you reaching a higher potential. Now we'll look at covalent bonding, which is when atoms share electrons in their outermost valence shell. So this is one of the primary ways that atoms actually form chemical compounds and begin settling into lower energy states or more stable configurations. This mirrors how subconscious balance and equilibrium that form from ideally healthy relationships. This is mainly like with the self, but can also be with other people. And again, this is ideally healthy ones, but there are also unhealthy relationships. It's just all about balance. So now we are going to have to look at molecular orbital theory. Woo! Yeah, I know, it sounds exciting. This is to get a better understanding of how semiconductors actually work later on, which I'll then relate to how information moves from higher to lower densities. So real quick, going back to the dual characteristics of electrons, being both a wave and a particle, this means that they can have two possible wave functions, either positive or negative, affecting whether we see an electron in one orbital, which is like closer to the nucleus of the atom, or further away, which is dependent on how much energy it has. So if we have two electrons, both with a positive wave function, they're going to overlap and the amplitude will be added together. This means that the electron is far more likely to be in closer to the center, meaning it has less energy. But if one is positive and the other is negative, then the center portion will actually cancel out, meaning the electron is far more likely to be further, so it's going to have a higher amount of energy. And these wave functions will start with the same potential energy levels, but as they merge, they split into higher and lower ones. And this difference in energy shows how you actually have to use energy to break covalent bonds, which is mirroring how when we form relationships that creates a sense of stability, whether that be actual stability or a false sense of stability, but we actually have to use energy or active will to break bonds, like karmic cord cutting. This also shows how certain suppressed aspects of the subconscious, be that through positive projection or negative suppression and denial, come to the surface in response to the other person in the relationship as they act as a mirror. So this is a microcosmic expression of karma, with the relationship being either balanced or imbalanced. And this is what we would label as either good or bad. So to give an example from my own life of a imbalanced relationship that's formed from karmic cycles and repeating patterns, would be that I found that I would often take responsibility for the emotional processing of the other person. And by doing this, like, I would provide a nurturing aspect to take care of them. But by doing this, it's actually draining me in a sense. Like, I don't have enough energy to pour back into myself, but I'm also doing a disservice to the other person by robbing them or stealing this opportunity of learning a karmic lesson. So that's another thing. When people say, like, don't steal, we usually just think of like possessions, but you can steal a lot from people, like time, opportunities to learn certain things. It doesn't just mean objects. There's more nuance to it. But anyways, as you add atoms together, rather than just going from like a single one to actually forming, like substances, the difference between energy levels from like just one orbital to the next becomes less and less, like as far as like how you can differentiate them. So at this point, we're no longer looking at distinct levels, but what are known as energy bands. And these energy bands have distinct ranges. So at this point, with billions of atoms, we need to look at energy occupancy and what's known as the band gap. The occupancy is the total number of electrons in that band versus its capacity. So if the band is partially full, then it doesn't take all that much energy to move up in the band. So like the electron with the most energy, it's not going to take that much for it to go up. But if it is at its full capacity, then it's actually going to take a lot more energy for that electron to go to the next energy band and cross what's known as the band gap. And we can actually relate this to how we process things emotionally reaching certain karmic thresholds. So there's certain karmic cycles that we go through. And we usually hit a kind of glass ceiling, in a sense, until we fully break a karmic cycle. And at that point, then we enter a new cycle, and we usually see an expansion in things like business or career. And just think of like any point in your life where something has happened suddenly and there's a drastic change. That is you entering a new karmic cycle. You are jumping a band gap. And it could be a negative or positive one. It really just depends as far as, what you need to process on a subconscious level. This is also how we define things as either conductors, semiconductors, or insulators. Anything with a partially filled band gap is a conductor, as it transmits electricity very easily, so there's far less resistance. And then a material with a large band gap is an insulator, and anything with a small band gap is a semiconductor. So now let's look at how semiconductors actually work on an atomic level in relation to things like temperature, and how we can expand this to see how information goes and propagates from higher to lower densities of reality. So semiconductors need to stay cool, and the reason for that is that the number of electrons that contribute to the conduction of electricity actually rises exponentially with temperature. So at low temperatures, semiconductors function as an insulator, but at high temperatures, they're conductors. So the temperature can be expanded essentially to different densities of reality within this framework. So lower layers of reality have less and less energy, creating more resistance. And again, like on a personal scale, this is usually seen as us trying to establish egoic control through attachment and a sense of safety. While at a larger scale, you can think of this in terms of like lokas or different layers of heaven, where higher layers of reality have far more energy, they're denser, and there's far more conductivity, with, again, going back to the idea of viscosity of space-time, going back to the mountain, with the river of space-time changing in viscosity, but this is also co-arising with the level of egoic resistance and attachment to the self that the consciousness has while experiencing whatever corresponding layer they're at. So semiconductors work by creating a band gap that the electron actually can't pass through unless there's enough energy for that electron to use. So the height of this band gap, or this kind of barrier, is dependent on the input voltage. So at room temperature, very few electrons can actually cross this gap. But as the voltage rises, the first electron with the most energy can cross, and then eventually, as the voltage increases and the gap shrinks, this allows for electrons with a medium energy level, and then eventually the electrons with the lowest level of energy will actually be able to cross. Now, in this parallel model, we can view the electrons as souls, and their energy levels are corresponding to the level of self-understanding that individual has, which is, them raising their frequency, getting to higher energy levels, going up the scale invariant axis. So we can expand upon this and see how this propagation and spreading of information and ideas through things like cultural zeitgeists, like whatever the prevalent thought is of a certain time period in civilizations or history, we can see that this is essentially information going from different band gaps, from higher to lower realities and back again. And we can see that these different band gaps could also be used to represent collective thought of certain groups, with the group itself being a rough collective representation of each individual's level of self-understanding and spiritual attainment, with some groups emphasizing individuality of the self versus other, and other groups focusing on collective thought and inclusivity. But again, I'm not saying one is better than the other. As with everything, there needs to be a balance. So like too much focus on the individual can lead to a lack of cooperation and empathy, as we're failing to see ourselves and ultimately the divine in other people. But too much focus on the collective to the point where you are giving up your sense of autonomy and individual expression is in itself a form of betrayal. So, like, for instance, in Dante's Inferno, when there's like the last layer of hell where you go for, like, if you betray someone, you can betray yourself too. Like, that is a form of betrayal. It's not just for, you stab someone in the back. You can stab yourself in the back. While the voltage that affects how quickly the electrons can go from one energy band to the next will actually correspond to like the collective subconscious of a group. And these groups can exist on small or large scales. So at a small scale, this might be a local government or a township electing to change some, certain policy or a certain way of doing things because someone, gave a really good speech and laid out all the bullet points and being like, hey, let's do this. While at a larger scale, this could be something like a radical change, like feminism, or a revolution to install a new government where certain large-scale ideas actually lead to an evolution in the way that we think. And again, this could also be a de-evolution. It really just depends on, again, karma and which timelines individuals have either chosen or not chosen to, essentially like exist in through free will, which ultimately affects the timeline of how this information spreads to smaller and larger groups, and then ultimately how, the course of history plays out. It's, like that quote from Albert Einstein, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. It's because it's, it's cyclical. But I hope that you guys found this interesting. That's all I've got for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. If you're curious to know more, I have a course on teachable.com. I'm going to put a link to that in the description. Be sure to leave a like and a comment if you liked it, if you found it interesting. And I'll catch you all in the next episode. Yeah.